Busted. A sitting member of Congress has finally been caught insider trading. A scathing 23-page report from the House Ethics Committee was just released, finding substantial evidence that 8-term Congressman Mike Kelly did in fact profit by trading on confidential information. Now, the report includes text messages, emails, trade confirmations, even interviews with his stockbroker. They have him dead to rights. But just wait until you hear his punishment. You won't believe it. After a 5-year investigation, the 10-member Committee on Ethics found overwhelming evidence that Mike Kelly not only sought international tariffs from the Commerce Department to benefit a company in his district, but also bought stock in that company the day after learning his request would be granted. And just months before the stock nearly tripled in short order. Well, technically, his wife bought the stock. Then again, technically, Nancy Pelosi's husband is the one who does all the trading. And I think we all know that's, you know what. So here's what happened. Now, Kelly represents the 16th District of Pennsylvania. And within his district are steel plants owned and operated by Cleveland-Cliffs, a publicly traded company. And back in 2020, the company got itself in some trouble. In fact, its stock price was down nearly 75% following COVID, which wreaked havoc on companies like Cleveland-Cliffs, who have massive overhead and expenses. And then suddenly the federal government tells you you've got to shut down your plant. Your people can't come to work. And even if you are still producing steel, nobody wants it because everything else is shut down. So this company is hemorrhaging cash. So Representative Mike Kelly steps in to help. Now, I want to be clear. The actions he took first were exactly what he was put in office to do. He's there to represent the constituents in his district, to protect them, their livelihoods, the companies within their district, and that is exactly what he did. Now, he was not supposed to dip his dirty little fingers into the cookie jar and make a few bucks for himself on the side, but we'll get to that in a second. So here's how this played out. You got this big steel company, they're hemorrhaging money. So Representative Mike Kelly, along with a few other members of Congress who also had some of this firm's operations in their state or in their district, sent a letter to the President of the United States concerning the 1,500 jobs across Pennsylvania and Ohio that would be decimated if something happened to these steel plants. Now, if you can remember, following COVID, whether they meant it or not, I don't know, but the federal government's big agenda was protect people's jobs. They did this through the PPP funds that were basically given to companies, and all you had to do was not fire anybody. They were with printing money like crazy. They just didn't want people to suddenly have no money. And so this is going to be a top priority for POTUS and anyone else in D.C. at that time. So Mr. Kelly sends this letter, makes a couple of phone calls, all of which is documented, by the way. The Ethics Committee's investigation was extremely thorough. They brought all the receipts, but after a couple of weeks, Cleveland-Cliffs is kind of freaking out. They're not hearing anything back, and so the CEO of Cleveland-Cliffs called Representative Kelly and said, I am going to have to start laying people off if the government cannot impose some tariffs overseas. Now, tariffs are a big thing with steel and lumber and other big commodity producers like this because their biggest competition is not another steel company down the road. It's China and Europe and Mexico and Australia and these other nations trying to produce it cheaper. So one of the best ways they can protect their business, if they can get government on their side, is for the federal government to say, okay, now every ounce of steel that comes into the United States is going to have a 25 or a 50 or a 100% tariff. And what that does is make U.S. steel suddenly very, very competitive. Because if your steel was $10 and theirs was $8, you're going to buy theirs. But then they put a 100% tariff. Now theirs is 16 and yours is 10. What do you know? Overnight, you're the cheap guy. Trump has done a lot with tariffs. In fact, more than any president in history that I'm aware of. In fact, I think there's something like 200% tariffs on international steel right now. But it was not the case in 2020. And so here we have a CEO. His company's hemorrhaging money. They're in trouble. He's reached out to his representative who sent a letter to the president. Nothing's happened in a couple of weeks. Then he calls the threats. Look, I got to start firing people. Tell me what to do. And so Kelly really gets to work, makes more calls, sends more emails and text messages, and it worked. In fact, he campaigned with the Department of Commerce, and here's where things get interesting. Because on April 28th, 2020, the Secretary of the Department of Commerce officially informed the CEO of Cleveland Cliffs that, yes, the Commerce Department intended to publicly announce what's called a self-initiated Section 232 investigation. Now, what this is just a reason to file the tariffs. So typically, they'll put these tariffs out when something is a threat to national security, which, as we all know, is Washington's favorite term, that lets them do any crime under the sun under the guise of national security. Now, obviously, steel coming in from Japan is probably not laced with explosives. It's probably not wired with listening devices going straight back to their intelligence community, but nonetheless, they made a case that, I don't know, I think this is a threat to national security, so we are going to put tariffs on them. Now, again, none of this is against the law. In fact, it's all very pro-America, whether you think it's the right thing to do or not. Protecting American firms at the expense of international firms, you're not going to get any fight from me about it. But here's what happened the next day. The next day, after Representative Kelly and the head of the Department of Commerce notified the Cleveland Cliffs CEO that, don't worry, we're putting on the tariffs, you're going to be saved, guess what Mike Kelly's wife did? She bought some stock. In which company, you might ask? Well, Cleveland Cliffs, the very company is just about to be saved from these tariffs. The same stock that's down, trading at $3.50, $4 a share, suddenly she scoops in and buys thousands of shares of this stock. Now, according to interviews during this investigation, she claims she never told her husband about this trade, at least not initially. Only down the road did it come up in conversation. But the evidence doesn't point to that. The sheer timing, the odds that this woman would buy this stock the day after her husband comes home and says, I did it, we're going to save the plant, everyone here in our district is going to be good, POTUS and Commerce have agreed, the day after she buys all this stock. First of all, bullshit. Okay, the odds of that being coincident didn't happen, no way. But if you need even more evidence, which I'm glad we have here, they even interviewed the Kelly's stockbroker. Now, this is a screenshot from the actual Ethics Committee's investigation. I want you to read this. It's so, even as I'm reading this, I can't believe this happened. I cannot believe that Congress actually did a thorough investigation of one of their own. It blows my mind. Never thought we'd see it. But look what it says here. On April 29, 2020, Ms. Kelly purchased 5,000 shares of stock in Cleveland Cliffs for $23,075. This purchase occurred the day after Representative Kelly's staff learned that Commerce would be opening a Section 232 investigation. That's, again, how they impose these tariffs. And here's where it gets interesting. Within Mrs. Kelly's vast investment portfolio, the Cleveland Cliffs stock was an outlier. First, unlike other holdings in her investment portfolio that were traded at PNC's discretion, meaning her investment manager picks her investments for her, the purchase of this stock had to be instructed and confirmed directly by Ms. Kelly in order for the transaction to be completed because it was not on PNC's investment platform. So think about this. You've got professional money managers who for years have managed your investments on their strategy with no input of your own, and then suddenly you call them up, insist they buy this one stock that they don't even offer to their clients. They had to go find it and purchase those shares for Mrs. Kelly. It goes on. It says, second, at the time of the purchase, Mrs. Kelly's investment activity consisted primarily of funds and bonds, as well as a trust that was substantially invested in, quote, large capitalization entities. The Cleveland Cliffs purchase was Miss Kelly's first purchase of an individual stock in near than a year. In other words, everything she owns is boring. She owns mutual funds. She owns bond funds. She owns large cap or big stocks, Apple, Amazon, Google, Nvidia, Walmart, right? Cleveland Cliffs is none of those things. It's not a fund. It's not a bond. It's not a large cap stock. It's a total outlier. As you can see, it was her first purchase of an individual stock in nearly a year. Now, he did disclose this trade. It was known as a PTR, a private transaction report, where, these things are filed back on an old house website. Nobody finds them unless you really know what to look for. But he just kind of hoped the thing fell under the radar, but it didn't. Someone on the ethics committee was either tipped off or noticed this and began an investigation over the last 5 years, has revealed what, in my opinion, is one of the most egregious, blatant, and obvious cases of insider trading that's ever been laid out. Now, I've laid all this out on a chart. You can see the timeline and how it took place. So here's where Kelly's trying to get the Commerce Department to put some tariffs on these other companies. Here's where Cleveland-Cliffs says, look, you got to do it. I'm going to lay people off. Here's where the Department of Commerce informed Cleveland-Cliffs that, yes, we are going to put these tariffs on. Here's the very next day when his wife buys 5,000 shares of stock, and it does pretty well. I mean, coming out of the gate here, let's see, she was up about 50% on this thing in just the first 6 weeks, but a couple months later, it gets even better. The CEO of Cleveland-Cliffs, again, reaches out to Representative Kelly, tells him, guess what? We're buying ArcelorMittal USA Steel. Well, that's not going to hurt the stock price. Probably a good idea to keep holding that. Then, of course, these tariffs were extended by President Trump. More good news. And then here we are, 9 months after the initial purchase. 9 months she held this stock before selling it for a total of $87,551. That is a $64,000 profit or return of 179%. Again, that is in just 9 months. So there you have it. In what has unfortunately become a common practice, a sitting member of Congress used information he had access to due to his position in the federal government that he was elected, for the people, to benefit himself financially. Now, a couple of things about this. Number one, again, the initial action, nothing wrong with it. You're supposed to protect your district. You're supposed to protect the livelihoods and the companies domestically that you're there to represent. I applaud him for that. Whether it was he or his wife who did this trading, I don't know, but it's a dirty trick. And you might be saying, all right, Ross, but he made 65 grand. It's not like Pelosi and these others who make tens of millions of dollars. Well, that's true, but it doesn't make it any more right. To some people in this country, $64,000 would change their entire life. And my guess is, had it not been for the heat from this ethics committee investigation, she would have held the stock longer, probably added more shares on and made much, much more money as the stock advanced. In fact, continued advancing over the next 12 months after she sold. In fact, she could have just about doubled her money again had she held into the following year. But nonetheless, the evidence is there. They've got them. There's this report, public record, filed by the House Ethics Committee, finding, in fact, that Mr. Kelly did use inside information to trade stock and profit from that. So, what are they going to do to him? They're going to throw this guy under the bus, right? Well, in 2012, Congress passed what is known as the Stock Act, which stands for Stop Trading on Congressional Knowledge Act of 2012. And within this, there are various penalties for violations of the Stock Act. Now, common violations, if you forget to report a trade or you just intentionally decide you're not going to follow the rules and report it, the fine is a whopping $200, which at best is a slap on the wrist. But there are additional stipulations for those found guilty of insider trading. That has been hard to come by. Yet folks like Nancy Pelosi, that's been doing this for 15 years, made $200 million. Everybody on the Hill knows she's doing this, and no one has ever brought any charges. I didn't think we'd see anything in the terms of a formal investigation from any other member of Congress, but here we have it. Official congressional report, the conclusion of a 5-year investigation by his peers that found unequivocally this politician did, in fact, violate the Stock Act. He did, in fact, betray the American people. And he did, in fact, trade on inside private information to his financial benefit. Now, they have a lot of leeway here. They can impose fines up to 3 to 4 times the profit made. They can recommend jail time. They can recommend just straight monetary policies of $1 million plus. There's lots of things they can do. So how bad do you think he got it? What do you think the recommendation is for our man Mike Kelly here, who has been caught red-handed? Well, let's take a look. The final section of this report, the conclusion, comes the committee's recommendations. They start off by, of course, patting themselves on their back about how they uphold their responsibility to maintain blah, 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 blah. But here we go. As Representative Kelly himself noted, he is an insider when it comes to Cleveland Cliffs, by virtue of his position as the representative for his district. He also repeatedly emphasized that the official actions he has taken with respect to GOES, which is the steel tariffs, uniquely benefit the Cleveland Cliffs plant, the only facility in the country currently producing this. Even when a company is a major employer in a member's district, it is not necessarily an impermissible conflict for the member to own the stock. But in this case, obviously, that was different. Because here, however, where there is evidence that the member had confidential information at the time his spouse was actively trading on the company's stock, while the member took official actions directly affecting the specific company, there is a unique and heightened ethical concern. So here's what they recommend. In order to avoid any continued appearance of impropriety, the committee's position is that Representative Kelly should ensure that he and Mrs. Kelly divest of all shares of Cleveland Cliffs before taking any further action related to the company. Yeah, that's their recommendation. Sell the stock. We don't think you should own it anymore. Heads up, bozos, your own investigation found out he sold it 4 years ago at the peak after nearly tripling his money. But after this monstrous investigation, which I have to assume cost millions of taxpayer dollars, the recommendation is, we think you should stop trading Cleveland Cliffs stock. If there was any doubt that this epidemic of insider trading by members of Congress will never come to an end, here it is. Even when they find it with mountains and mountains of evidence, the appendix was something like 114 pages, all full of emails, text messages, trade transactions. It's all there, clear as day. No disciplinary actions will be held. So there it is, folks, as clear as you're ever going to find it, insider trading by Congress, and of course, as usual for our friends in D.C., zero consequences. If you want to learn more about insider trading, or if you just want to be notified when we see these big insider trades, when the next time one of these guys starts buying a big stock in his own district randomly for the first time in years, right before it could very well shoot up 170, 180% like this one, click the button in the corner, subscribe to this channel. We share this stuff with members each and every week, and we'll be sure to put this in front of you as soon as it becomes public record.